a group meeting in a university church basement. Did any of you ever heard of the Good Friday experiment? Okay, probably. You know what I'm thinking about? It's a great story. I'm giggling already not because I'm stoned, but because the people in the Good Friday experiment were stoned. It was this experiment where a bunch of people met in the church basement on a Good Friday, which is a Christian celebration of the death of Jesus, and they did a nice controlled experiment where half of them did LSD and the other half didn't, and then they tried to see who was having religious experiences. I wasn't there, I'm happy to say. Interestingly, Huston Smith was there. He's a rather famous scholar of religion, and I'm not sure what his religious experience was, but he ultimately has become a presenter of interreligious dialogue. He's very big on the fact that he was raised Christian, but he does Zen meditation. He does the Islamic prayers regularly. He fancies himself a guy who has sort of brought religion together. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon. I seem to have left all my LSD at home, so I'm just going to talk about religion. This is a picture from a story that probably some of you know quite well. There's this old story. In fact, it comes from India. It starts with this poetic line about the 6 blind men of Hindustan. Regardless of that term, it comes from this idea that these 6 blind men all go looking at this. Well, they don't look, obviously. They discover this elephant, and then each of them describes the elephant as the best way he can. And of course, the point of the story is that you know, this guy thinks an elephant's like a tree, and this guy thinks an elephant's like a spear, and this guy thinks an elephant's like a snake, and that guy thinks an elephant's like a rope. And the whole point of the story, of course, is that if they could just see the bigger picture, they would realize they're all describing the same thing. They're just describing it differently from their different perspectives. And this is, for some people, become a kind of paradigmatic parable, if you will, of how religion really ought to be understood. Everybody's religion, in some sense, is coming at the great mystery of ultimate being from different perspectives, and yet ultimately all are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to describe this great phenomenon, here obviously represented by the elephant, and each of them maybe gets it right, kind of, but each of them gets it wrong insofar as he's, of course, grasping only a tiny bit of it. It is a parable that is meant to convey the possibility of interreligious agreement, ultimately, by sort of transcending our more parochial approaches, our doctrines, and so on. And yet, part of the difficulty is what I sometimes call the problem of who sees the elephant. I mean, it's all well and good to say that in some sense they're all approaching the great ultimate from different perspectives, but you can only claim that if somebody claims to be seeing that everybody else is only seeing part. Otherwise, what you've got is just fundamental disagreement. And the interesting thing about, I mean, in sort of 20 years of teaching undergraduate religion classes, I meet a lot of people who are, on the one hand, very convinced that their form of religion is clearly right, but I get probably even more people who take this kind of, oh, everybody's kind of the same, we all agree. And I'm always in the position of on the one hand, trying to talk about the possibility of interreligious dialogue, but on the other hand, trying to dissuade people from a rather naive view that everybody's somehow the same. Because in a great extent, I think they aren't. In a way, it's been compared with house pets. I mean, there's a sense in which house pets are all the same because they all function as house pets. But of course, nobody would say a cat and a dog and a goldfish are all the same. There's certainly important differences. And so I'm going to talk about Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam as ways in which they are similar. They're doing similar things. They talk about similar concepts, but of course, really important differences. And when it comes to this discussion, it may be you can focus either way, either on the things that seem to be similar or on the things that seem to be different, because both, I think, are important parts of an honest dialogue. I had a friend of mine draw that picture. She's a wonderful artist. And I just say, can you make this story? And she borrowed some figures from a kid's book and constructed that picture. She's just wonderful. I'll show you another picture she drew at the end. But this is where we start. There is certainly the sense in which religions all over the world want to talk about something. And the something starts with a capital S. I mean, they aren't all just talking about furniture. They're talking about something that seems to transcend the mundane, something that seems to transcend our normal categories of explanation and so on. I call it here God. It's of course a generic term in a way, and here are my three symbolic representations. You probably recognize them. At least you recognize some of them, I suspect. It is arguable that the probably least recognizable might be this one, the pointed Hebrew for Yahweh. If you go into the Hebrew Bible, which of course Christians also adapt as their so-called Old Testament, you have the name of God as He who is, or actually more accurately, God calls Himself I who am. It's a really great philosophical concept, and a lot of philosophers, Christian philosophers of history, pin a lot of interesting analysis on the idea that God calls Himself I am. This one here, of course, the calligraphic presentation of the name of God in Arabic, and this one here, Om, right? The Om symbol coming out of India. It's hard to know. It's hard to know what to do with the God concept in India in some ways, because of course Om is in one sense not a name or a description. It's a noise, and yet as I like to say to students once in a while, if you think of, in my house I sometimes sing to the furnace. I don't know if any of you ever do that. I discovered it once when I was yelling at my children many years ago. In the back room I yell, Carl! And the furnace goes, right? Because sheets of metal have a resonance. And if you hit that note, the thing goes, and so I got kind of intrigued, and I'd stand in the back room going, and the whole room would go, and of course if you change the note half a step, it doesn't do it. If you change it a little higher, it doesn't do it. You hit the note right, and the whole room kind of goes, well, think of the whole universe as having a resonance. If you can think of the whole universe as having a resonance, and if you say that note, if you sing that note, you resonate with the whole universe, this is it. That's the note. It is in some sense not a name, it is a resonance. And the famous mystical literature of India talks about Om as synonymous with Brahman. It's really a fascinating sort of notion. Maybe we can talk about it. But all three of these religions have this concept, at least in its barest sense. There is ultimately behind the universe that we see, hear, taste, touch, and smell, there is something, put a capital S on it, something more. There is a great one, a great something. Again, I realize I'm being vague, but I kind of have to be vague to be general enough to capture everything we're doing. And yet, of course, the way in which these are different is just as important as the way in which they're the same. The generality and the vagueness of this concept so far is not going to be able to hide the fact that there's important differences. One important issue is the question, so to speak, of how does this God manifest? How is this God represented here for us? And this traditionally is going to mark one of the most important areas of dispute. Because what I have pictured here, of course, the Hindu gods, who in some sense manifest or represent, descend out of the absolute and ultimate, they are, well, here's one. If you know your iconography of Hinduism, you recognize Krishna when you see him. Krishna's an easy guy to recognize with the flute. He's always got a flute. Even when he's a baby, he's got a flute. This one, of course, Jesus, the For Christians, the manifestation of God on earth, and here for Muslims. Right. The point is, of course, there is no manifestation of God on earth. Certainly nothing you can depict. The only thing that comes closest to the representation of God on earth would have to be verbal. It would have to be the recitation of the Quran. But even that, of course, isn't like God incarnate, where these people would say that the deity has entered into the world here, or entered into the world here. Muslims will not accept that idea. Again, where in Islamic history there have been people who pushed that edge. Let me say this really quickly. I'm talking real generalities here. I mean, Islam is much broader than the thing I'm going to talk about. Christianity is broader. Hinduism is broader than the thing I'm going to talk about. There have been Muslims who have sort of played with this notion that maybe there's a representation, but they tend not to be well accepted. Let's just leave it there. But all I want to say is, therefore, if you think about these things in their most orthodox and traditional forms, although even saying that is tricky, Orthodox Hinduism, that term just isn't going to work very well. But if you think about them in their most standard historical representations, it is fair, I think, to say that in Hinduism you have a number of representations of the deity on earth. In Christianity, you have one. In Islam, you don't have any. And this already brings us to an important understanding of difference, even though it is possible in this slide to think that really maybe we're all talking about the same thing. When we bring it down to, okay, now what can we know about this deity? What are our sources of knowledge? What's our sort of epistemology, you might say, of religion here? Then you move to this kind of a picture and you begin to see where the differences really unfold. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about these similarities and these differences. I'm going to try to unpack some of these concepts one by one. I'm going to talk about Hinduism first, because in some ways, I'm going to talk about Hinduism first and then Islam second, partially because I think they represent a kind of two very different sides, and Christianity falls in a peculiar way kind of in between. Again, not speaking historically, not chronologically by any means, but just sort of philosophically. So I'm going to start here. When we talk about Hinduism, the idea, there are kind of two different schools that develop out of the way people talk about Hinduism, and for a lot of people, they think of Hinduism primarily as polytheistic, obviously the word meaning many, many gods. And indeed, in one sense, there they are. I mean, there's no question that in one sense, or one understanding of Hinduism, there are just many, many gods. But in another sense, another way of understanding Hindu philosophy is to start here. Here's the oneness. Here's the singularity. This is the ultimate being in the most abstract sense. And depending on which texts and which teachers of Hinduism you follow, you will get different emphases here. But this is a concept that appears especially going around the, at least most explicitly, somewhere around the 6th, 7th centuries BCE, and you see it appear especially in the Upanishad literature. It's the emphasis coming out of even the earlier Vedic literature, which at least on its surface again is mostly about numerous gods. What gets unpacked around the 6th, 7th centuries BCE is an emphasis that behind all the gods there's really this one. And in fact, this term Brahman actually seems to be something of like spirit. It's an abstraction in many ways. And when we start to talk about it, they use terms like the one, simply. Or sometimes my favorite, one without a second. The one without a second suggests that Brahman is literally all that is truly real. There are passages from the Upanishads that say, if you even think there is something besides Brahman, then you're just mistaken. This ultimately unpacks, interestingly, in some ways it sounds kind of like something Muslims would say about God having no partners. We'll get to that. But interestingly, in the philosophical versions of Hinduism, this ultimately implies a kind of philosophical monism. The term monism means that not only is there only one God, but in the sense everything is that God. Everything is Brahman. There is nothing but Brahman. So that this is Brahman, and this thing is Brahman. It's just that we make the mistake of seeing the plurality of things and failing to see the unity of things. And if you could, so to speak, abstract yourself away from the furniture in this room. There's a chair, there's a couch, but it's really all furniture. But if you would abstract even farther away to all of the objects in this room, they'd all be objects. But if you could abstract even farther away, you'd get down to the fact that there is just being. Pure being. Being itself. And that being itself is what all things share. And thus all things have as their true essence the nature of Brahman. This sort of complete abstraction of pure being is what the Upanishads tries to unpack and ultimately has implications about what it means to find salvation. Hold on, wiggling my fingers around that term because it's a bit tricky. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But it's also understood in Hinduism that this concept, this oneness, this pure abstraction of being, is difficult for most of us to comprehend. It's not like you can go take a picture of it. It's not like you can say, well, there you go. It's hard to find. And therefore, it is understood that there have been numerous manifestations of this deity, of this ultimate power. And these numerous manifestations give people a face. They give people an object, a person to relate to. It is in fact interesting, just grammatically, that this term is grammatically neuter. That is to say, it's it. Whereas these are he and she. Precisely because you don't talk to it. There aren't temples to Brahman. Don't get it confused with the god Brahma. It's different. Brahman here is not a god. It is not a relational being. It is a kind of abstraction. It's kind of like energy. It's kind of like, they say that if you go out into the deepest parts of space, there's still that, 2 degrees Kelvin that is the vibration left over from the Big Bang. That's sort of the concept. There is this oomph that's out there in the universe. But again, this is difficult to relate to. Again, a neuter noun. It's best to say it. And therefore, Hinduism allows and indeed encourages the idea that there have been many incarnations of deity in the earth as objects of relation, so that you can worship, so that you can speak, so that you can love, so that you can interact with deity in a way that you can't hear, but you can hear. And thus we get Shiva and Kali and Krishna and Durga and Saraswati, and interestingly, even some recent people, Anandamayi and Satya Sai Baba. Interestingly, in Hinduism, there's no reason to think that there can't be more gods. If the ultimate it here manifests multiple times into the physical world for human relation, then there's no reason it has to be some ancient sort of mythic being. This guy just recently died, I think last year. Didn't Sai Baba just die on Easter, I think, last year? Male and female, interestingly kind of mythical characters. I mean, the elephant-headed Ganesh, these kind of interesting beings. And what that allows, of course, is a place for temples, for worship, for devotion. And in the process of that, therefore, you get two interestingly different pathways of spirituality. On the one hand, there is the pathway of devotion. If what appeals to you is one of these manifestations of deity, then you go to temple. You go to temple and you give offerings. You go to temple and you do worship. You go to temple with a whole series of possible rituals that are relational. They allow you to relate like a speaker to a hearer, and vice versa. In the multiple temples of Hinduism, lots of color, lots of flowers, famous sort of ideas of leaving offerings to these various gods, and yet not like kill your firstborn or something. It's leave flowers, leave a coin, leave fruit. It's very, very much the issue is devotion. It's about one's spiritual connection with this deity. And again, interestingly, it can be any number of different deities. That's why here in the good old U.S. of A., if you've ever been out, for example, to the Rama temple in Lamont, I mean, there's numerous different deities. There's the Rama temple, and you can walk down the hallway and go over to the Shiva temple, and it's really kind of interesting. I like to urge students to go there because you get a real feel for the variety of deities and the possibility of devotional practice. But interestingly, this is another option entirely. Because if you are of a more philosophical and to an extent ascetic bent, then there is the possibility of going directly to Brahman, to this ultimate oneness. But you can't do it through a face, you can't do it through a relation, you have to do it through, in some sense, pure being. But if this, in some sense, is Brahman, and this is, in some sense, Brahman, and this wall, and, well, so am I, in some sense, Brahman. And so the primary process is going to be renunciation. You step away from the plurality of the world, step away from its distracting sensuality, and you seek inward. And the idea that ultimately you can find a kind of selfhood, a kind of energy, a kind of soul in yourself that ultimately is the essence of Brahman, is an interestingly different path that here is called the path of renunciation. To renounce means that I'm not going to get married, I'm not going to have a career, I'm not going to make money, I am going to give up what most people think of as their normal life, and I am going to try to find the inward great reality, put capital letters on that, that is Brahman. So that more so in India, obviously, than in the United States, you don't often walk down the street and see somebody covered with ashes in a meditative pose. But you do in India, as probably a lot of you know. It's an interesting phenomenon, the idea of the holy man who has left behind the world, who in some sense is seeking a kind of pure interrelation with the ultimate being. And certain forms of this have made their way into the West here in groups like transcendental meditation groups and Vedanta, Vedantic Hinduism, meaning the end of the Vedas, where you get focus on the scriptures of the Upanishads and the emphasis on the pure ultimacy of being. But in an interesting way, for Hindus, these are not contradictory. You do find passages within the scriptures that suggest, from one perspective, this one is easier, or this one's better, and in another perspective, this one's more direct, or this one's more powerful. But for general Hindu culture, these are both options. I think it might be obvious that the overwhelming majority of Hindus go this way. There are some that go this way, but this is clearly the more difficult path. You might say this is straight up the face of the mountain, and this is up a nice curvy road. But again, part of it is to see the logic of this. If you think of ultimate being in its Om sense, then this is the way. If you think of it in its polytheistic sense, then this is the way. And so in Hinduism, you have these different pathways. The renunciation pathway gives you what they would call salvation by knowledge, sometimes called Jnana Marga, the pathway of knowledge. Here the knowledge isn't what you guys are getting from the University of Chicago. It's not like passing a test. It is rather insight. It is knowledge in the Gnostic esoteric sense. So that what happens is you have to renounce the world and meditate to find this deeper inner self. Thus these quotes from the Katha Upanishad: the self is hidden in all beings and does not shine forth, but it is seen by the subtle seers through their sharp and subtle intellect. A wise man should keep down speech and mind. He should keep them within the self, which is knowledge. He who has perceived that which is without sound, without touch, without form, without decay, without taste, eternal, without smell, without being, beginning, without end, beyond the great and unchangeable, is freed from the jaws of death. All of this apophatic language, as we call it, apophasis, means describing something not by what it is, but describing it by what it isn't. So when you see a long line of things like without sound, without touch, what they're trying to talk about is Brahman, this Om, because it is not anything in this world. It is hiding inside everything in this world, including me. And so the way of renunciation is a matter of meditation, a matter of inward seeking till you find this pure being inside. Here's a passage from the Mundaka Upanishad that actually kind of criticizes the idea that you can gain heaven by doing certain kinds of good deeds or something. It says, considering sacrifice and good works as the best, these fools know no higher good, and having enjoyed their reward on the height of heaven, gained by good works, they enter again this world or a lower one. What this is referring to is reincarnation. And it suggests that you can do good deeds, you can get good karma, you can even go to heaven for a while. But ultimately, if you want union with the One, oneness with the Great One of Brahman, then that's not enough, because you'll just get reborn back into the world, or even a lower one. But those who practice penance and faith out in the forest, tranquil, wise, living on alms, they depart free from the passion through the sun to where that immortal person dwells whose nature is imperishable. What that's referring to is those people who renounce the world, who practice meditation, who conquer all desire and enter into the oneness of this great being. So this is sort of the pathway of knowledge, the pathway of renunciation. And again, that's the hard way. The pathway of devotion is, you might say, the easier way. It is for the overwhelming majority, as I said, of Hindus. These passages taken from the Bhagavad Gita are spoken by the god Krishna. But they can be applied, and in fact you find these verses quoted in lots of temples, whether it's about the god Krishna or not. When those who do rituals to gain karma have long enjoyed the world of heaven, and their merit is exhausted, they enter the mortal world. This is saying, in fact, exactly the same thing as the last one. Getting good karma just isn't quite enough, because you can get good karma, you can even have a sort of heavenly existence, but it's temporary. But it goes on to say, following the duties ordained in sacred lore, desiring desires, they obtain what is transient. So these people, if you're just trying to get good karma to get to heaven or something, that's still just transient. But, Krishna says, men who worship me, thinking only of me, always disciplined, they win the reward that I secure. In that sense, Krishna becomes a savior figure. It isn't about doing enough good deeds to earn heaven, because in a way, good karma just gets you a kind of temporary reward. It's much better to devote yourself to this deity. It is more arduous, says Krishna, when those who renounce the world to find salvation seek in reason my unmanifest nature. Krishna is saying, I am Brahman. I have an unmanifest nature. But he's saying, this is hard. It's going to be much easier, he says, for those of us who are, let's face it, constrained by our bodies. In other words, we're sensual beings. The unmanifest way is hard to attain. But men intent on me renounce all actions to me and worship me, meditating with singular discipline. When they entrust reason to me, Arjuna, the guy Krishna is talking to, I soon arise to rescue them from the ocean of death and rebirth. Krishna is here saying, you know, that whole meditative path is tough. So why not just worship me and I will be, in a sense, your savior? That's what qualifies ultimately as the way of devotion, or bhakti. That's going to be the better way for, let's face it, most of us who, as he says, are constrained by our sensual bodies. So here's kind of a summary. I realize there's a whole lot more to it, but there is this one absolute being. This is Brahman, sometimes called the Self, interestingly, with a capital S, to distinguish it from my sense of ego. Unmanifest, unknowable through any form of revelation. It's all apophatic theology. To find this Brahman, one must renounce the world, meditate, find the deeper self hidden inside. But because this is so difficult, the overwhelming majority of Hindus would prefer the Bhakti Marga, the pathway of devotion, seeking salvation through one of the gods. Salvation then, in this case, is by devotion, losing attachment to one's sensuality, not by renunciation, but by devotion to a deity. Which god? It doesn't really matter. Be devoted, do ritual, do good actions unto Krishna or some other deity, and you will come to him in the end of life. This idea of salvation has a tendency, as I say here, towards universalism, because in an interesting way, Hinduism is capable of being religion to anybody. One of the boasts, in a way, of Hinduism is that it's a very open religion, because there's no sense in which it can disqualify anybody. Indeed, one of the interesting, I love this picture. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is Jesus and Krishna dancing off into the cosmos. Of course, this is a Hindu picture. Christians wouldn't like this picture much. But for a Hindu thinking, I mean, I have been I have been, I have a picture in some of my stuff I show students once in a while, which is just pictures of various Hindu gods, and Jesus is in there several times. There's no reason to think Jesus can't be in there. And in this case, this is the famous teacher and mystic Ramakrishna, and he became famous for the fact that he started to have visions. He started by having visions of Kali, the god that the goddess he primarily worshipped. But then later he started to have visions of Shiva, he started to have visions of Rama, and he started to have visions of Jesus. Then he started to have visions of Muhammad, and he reached the conclusion that in this deeper religious experience, any religion would fit into the same experience. And so Hinduism has this capacity, I think, for absorption, for letting any religion be Hindu, in a sense. One thing I think is interesting about that is, on the one hand, while it is very inclusive, Hinduism is inclusive on its own terms. What I mean by that is, just as I said, this would be a nice picture for a Hindu, but I think a Christian would have trouble with it. Even more so when Ramakrishna says, oh yes, I'm also having visions of Muhammad, that makes me also a Muslim. I think most Muslims will say, no, it doesn't. What do you mean, visions of Muhammad? He's not even the God in this religion. And so in one sense, by saying you're absorbing the other religions, you're really in some ways interpreting them in your own terms. It isn't quite as absorptive and open as it may seem, because it absorbs by its own definitions. And those definitions do end up being somewhat exclusive. So it's interestingly easy, so to speak, to make other religions into Hinduism. On the other hand, most of the people that are those other religions wouldn't necessarily like that as a favor. Switching to the other end of the scale, in a sense. Islam famously doesn't allow pictures. As an aniconic religion, Islam has been famously without artistic depiction. It is not accidental that if you try to think of the greatest artistic forms of Islam, you get things like architecture, and of course especially calligraphy. Because for Muslims, the primary manifestation of God's thought, not God himself, but of God's thought on earth is text. And so that Muslims really encourage the art of calligraphy is evident. You see it all over the place in Muslim countries, on Muslim shrines. It's gorgeous work. But you don't see icons, you don't see iconography, you don't see pictures, because God cannot be represented and is not represented in any form. The idea that God would manifest on earth himself, just no. It's just no. And in that sense, we have a rather strong sense that the one God is the only God and everything else is an idol. Right from the beginning, the Prophet Muhammad's primary emphases when he starts to receive the revelations of the Quran in Mecca are two really foundational points. One is about compassion for the poor, that wealth will not save you. He's dealing with the wealthy merchants of Mecca. But the other is that Mecca at that time was heavily polytheistic. Lots of gods, lots of spirits. It was a way of keeping the peace, to let everybody bring their gods into Mecca, and that way everybody kind of would get along. And Muhammad says, no. One God, not depicted, not made into statues, never ever, you just got to stop. And this becomes, of course, in some ways, the reason that he was so rejected and explains the early persecutions of the Muslims in the city of Mecca in the first 12 years or so of his career as a prophet. The implication is that shirk, this concept of association, what that refers to is that if you think there's anything sort of on the level of God, if you think there's anything that shares God's status, if you think there can be anything that is even in the same ballpark as God, you are fundamentally wrong. Shirk association means to associate anything with God. God is the creator. God is the only creator. God is the eternal being, the absolute being. Everything else isn't. There you go. God doesn't share glory with anything. God doesn't share essence with anything. And in that respect, This idea of God's uniqueness, God's absolute oneness, is fundamental to Islamic thinking. Right there you can begin to see why we've got some interesting problems with the way at least Hinduism is ultimately expressed and the way that Islam is expressed. God doesn't manifest. God does not incarnate. This word, of course, carne, right? Chili con carne means meat. So when something incarnates, it means it enters into flesh. God does not enter into flesh. It doesn't happen here. God interacts with humanity through messages delivered to specific people over the course of human history. Muslims believe that God has spoken to Adam, Noah, Abraham, David, Hud, Salih, and a number of other prophets, many of them mentioned from the Old Testament. Jesus is included. Jesus is understood to be a prophet. He's understood to be Messiah. I did this on purpose. Jesus is a word, but not the word. This is an interesting issue in the disputes between Christians and Muslims. The Quran has a verse that says that he was a word from God, but where in the Christian gospel it says Jesus was the word, it means something different. It's Christians. Well, I'll get to that later. That Jesus received a message from God, that Jesus is a prophet of God. Muslims have no trouble with that. But that Jesus could be a manifestation of God, heavens no. So along comes Muhammad as the final prophet, and that completes the message of God because they understand the Quran to be the final and perfect word of God. That means that salvation is not by finding God within you. Certainly, that's not going to work. But submission. The very term Islam means submission. God will not forgive those who serve other gods beside him, but he will forgive whom he will of other sins. He who serves other gods beside him is guilty of a heinous sin. He that does evil shall be requited with evil. He shall find none beside God to protect or to help him. Believers who do good works, both men and women, shall enter paradise. Those whose good deeds weigh heavy in the scale shall triumph. Those whose deeds are light shall forfeit their souls and abide in hell. The day of judgment we shall bring a scroll which will have all of your deeds on it, and this idea of submission means you have recognized God and you have submitted your life to God. Realize that you can give money to the poor, and that's a good thing. But giving money to the poor because you are obedient to God is something else. It's something better, something more. So salvation means two things. One, you must believe. You must understand that there is a God. The Shahada, the declaration of faith, is I witness there is one God and Muhammad is his prophet. There's two parts. Recognizing the God and recognizing that there is a message. And of course, doing the things that you're told. Obey God and his apostle. We may repent of our sins. We must hope for mercy. Just as it says that God is counting every deed, you have these angels on your shoulders counting each deed. It is also true that God is merciful and God will forgive. It's important that you end up with this idea of doing what you're told, in a sense, submitting to God, obeying God, and yet we trust that God is forgiving and merciful. I put these things here to contrast with the other two. God will hold those who worship other gods up to shame on the day of resurrection. Where are your idols now? Against Christianity, it says very explicitly, no soul shall bear another's burden, and each man shall be judged only by his own labors. There are explicit verses in the Quran that say that the Christian idea of Jesus as the Son of God, as the divine Savior, are just fundamentally wrong. Those cannot fit. So here's my summary. I'm told I'm out of time. An uncompromising monotheism, I call it. A revealed religion. God speaks to humanity through prophets. Soteriology means the salvation idea is a final and decisive judgment of one's deeds, especially one's deeds as submission to God, obedience to his will. Thus, a tendency to be tolerant of other revealed religions, the people of the book, as more or less corrupted versions of the message. In other words, it's commonly noted in Islam that Jews and Christians at least got their revelation, even if they've kind of gotten it wrong. But Islam is now delivered as the only true faith, according to the Quran there. And if someone chooses a faith other than Islam, it will not be accepted of him. In that sense, a very strict and emphatic point about the oneness and the ultimacy of God and the finality of the message. I was urged to ask if there are bridges here. This is a shrine of a Sufi saint. It's an interesting phenomenon that in India, this one's outside of Fatehpur Sikri, some of you don't know if they've ever been there, fascinating, where this particular Sufi
is actually revered by both Muslims and Hindus as a kind of holy man. And yet, when I showed pictures like this to some of my Muslim students, they were really upset. They said, "No, this is not. You can't pray at this shrine. That's not Islam." And yet, in India, in some places, these Sufi shrines do bring both religions kind of together. This is the Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism, who also, in his own way, thought he was bringing Hindu and Islamic elements together. The religion of Sikhism itself is an interesting amalgam of certain aspects of Hinduism, and yet an emphasis on the one God. Christianity in 30 seconds. Go. Like Islam, a revealed religion, that is to say, God speaks to humanity through scriptures, through prophets. Christians, however, have this one bizarre thing that puts them in between. And by bizarre, please, I don't mean anything insulting. I just mean it's really unusual, because like Islam, Christians would say there's only one God, transcendent above all worlds, not part of all being or something like that. But like Hindus, Christians would say God has manifested in the flesh. God has incarnated. But God incarnated once and once only, at a specific time, in a specific person, for a very specific purpose. And so the Christian concept is importantly like Hinduism in the idea of having a manifestation of God on earth in human form, and yet importantly like Islam for emphasizing the absolute transcendence and oneness of God, because the one and only one manifestation of God on earth is unlike Islam, as I say here, because of course Muslims wouldn't say God ever manifested on earth, but also unlike Hinduism because God doesn't repeatedly manifest on earth. The complex relation that develops then in this idea between the idea that God is manifested one time and yet God is also absolutely transcended is what culminates in the doctrine of the Trinity. Obviously, this one manifestation is Jesus. You've probably heard the stories. I probably don't have to tell them. But for Christians, the emphasis is this. The purpose of this one and one only manifestation is for the salvation of humanity. Christians understand us to be separated from God by sin, and the only hope for humanity is that God either has to say, "Oh, sin's okay, don't worry about it, I'll just let it go," or God has to send everybody to hell. God is either going to be lax or God is going to be absolutely just. And yet that means that either anybody gets in for nothing or nobody gets in. Unless God sends this one really strange story. What Christians think happened this one and only one time is that God sent someone that would pay for all sin, so that every sin is forgiven in this one sacrifice of Jesus. And yet that means that sin is not merely ignored. It means that in some sense God can be absolutely just by punishing all sin, and yet God can also be absolutely loving by forgiving all sin. And so what Christians think is that this one time and one time only, for the sake of the salvation of humanity, God sends a single manifestation that can be the bearer of sin for the entire world. This bearer of sin has to be human, because he suffers and dies. Has to be a human to bear human sin, they would say. But of course no normal human could bear all of human sin, because he has to be sinless and infinite. And therefore, Christians think Jesus is the Son of God. This is the basic concept that ultimately leads us to their concept of salvation by grace. This idea that call upon the name of Christ, call upon the suffering and death of Jesus, realize that in some sense Jesus' sacrifice is my punishment, is my hell. And by doing that, your sins are completely relieved and forgiven. This idea of grace means that God does not punish you, and yet God does punish sin. In other words, again, God is absolutely just and absolutely merciful at the same time, so Christians would say. And here are some of the quotes. By his wounds we are healed, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. God loved the world. It's when they pull up on signs at baseball games. By grace you are saved through faith. It isn't because you did enough good deeds, because there isn't enough good deeds. And that's the whole point of this particular work. Thus, the taking on of sin, and yet the result of the taking on of all sin is the forgiveness of all sin. Thus, the death and resurrection as the great historic symbols of that. So here's the complexity that Christians ultimately have to develop about God, developing the concept of Trinity. There, Trinity. We can talk about that if you want. It is an interesting historical phenomenon, how the concept of Trinity develops in the early centuries of Christianity, how it appears in the Christian scriptures, and the different ways that you can understand it. I mean, it does have its own formulations that make sense. I realize it's tricky. But here's my Christian summary, that in some sense it's a salvific religion from the beginning, the idea that sinful people have to stand in front of a righteous God. They borrow from Judaism, the monotheistic religion. There is only one God, the creator of all things. Nothing created is God. And yet, God does manifest himself in this one place, this one time, for this one absolutely crucial purpose, where you realize the word crucial is a pun, because it means cross. So that's the point. Here's some comparative points. One God, yes, in all three of the religions in a sense, but understood importantly differently. The unmanifest it of Om, the revealing, absolutely unified God of Islam, the triune God of Christianity. Yes, one, and yet, interestingly, different. God manifest many times, one time, no times. Salvation by devotion, by submission, by grace, by meditation. Realize that these differences are in some cases very important and sometimes form the points of dispute, so that as you get into discussions, if you choose to do so, here's my last picture. Because of course, in one sense, you know, here they are all looking at the elephant, but on the other hand, maybe that's it. I mean, maybe there isn't an elephant. Maybe they're just different, and I don't know if we can just say they're all the same. We might have to say we've got differences, and I don't know if there's an elephant.
All right, so thank you again, Dr. Ricker.
Oh, sure. Glad to do it.
Okay, so now we're going to hear from different practitioners of each of the faiths that we just discussed.
I grew up in a family that was considered Christian, but when it came down to it, we really didn't live it out. We weren't really Christian when it came down to it. So when I was younger, my life really revolved around my family. A pretty big family, kind of a little crazy. But when it came to dealing with our issues, we really didn't show love or forgiveness the way that Jesus taught. So that was just really different. So two of my cousins growing up, they really lived differently. Their lives looked different. And when I was in high school, they came and they talked to me and they told me how to really follow God and have a relationship with Him. They told me that being a Christian wasn't about going to church every Sunday and living a good life, but it was about really understanding that God loves me, and that really understanding that I wasn't good, and that because of sin, I'm separated from God, but that God had a solution for that. That God sent Jesus to pay the price of my sin. So they also told me that I had to make a personal decision to accept Jesus into my life. And so that day I made a personal decision to accept Jesus into my life. And over the next few years after that, my life really just started changing. And it changed in many ways, but two of the main things that really changed would be my view of myself and relationships with other people. So I really was able to understand that that God loved me and I was a daughter of God, and not that I had to do anything to earn His love, or it's not what I did or didn't do, but it was about the fact that He loved me. So that was really changed me. And another big thing was my relationships with other people. I was able to really have deep relationships and really just be honest, and not really be consumed by what people think of me or being liked by people, but really just being real with other people. So this allowed me to just really restore some broken relationships with my family and things like that. But it allowed me to just lay out my life before other people and really experience forgiveness and love in a way that I never did before. So for me, following Jesus daily means just really spending time with Him every day, and also getting to know Him more. And to get to know Him more, that means I'd have to read His Word, because that's how you get to know Him. So that, and to really just live out what I'm learning, and to live out what I'm learning through the Bible. So now that I understand that Jesus died on the cross for me because He loved me, I actually desire to be a real follower of Christ and to live it out every day. So, thank you.
Dr. Richter, in the course of explaining the different aspects of Hinduism, he pointed out that there's two main divisions: the path of renunciation, or path of seeking knowledge, the other path of devotion. So I guess we have a set time, and we cut it between two of us who sort of have different relationships with different aspects of this. So the person who, Suraj, is, would you like to go? Or,
Yeah, come on up. You guys can stand there together.
Okay, so being brought up in a Hindu family, I naturally accepted some of the truths put forth by my religion. That my fate is determined by past action, that the world is an illusion, that God is present everywhere, and so on. But my propensity to seek guidance in Hindu scriptures increased all the more because my faith did not suppress, but in fact encouraged skepticism, and encouraged skepticism to serve as a motivation for spiritual inquiry. And I think it's very natural for all of us, as it definitely was for me, to at some point in our lives step back and wonder what is the purpose of our existence. Is there any meaning in what we do? And I found myself always striving for various goals and seeking to satisfy various appetites. Yet any victory or pleasure I've ever experienced, I realized, was pretty transient. And I think it's the awareness of the futility in this way of living and the aspiration to transcend it that characterizes a Hindu despite his various form of religious practice. And perhaps that might explain, such a general understanding of Hinduism might explain why so many people with such widely differing methods of religious practice may still be deemed a Hindu, so it's a sort of umbrella term. But I think Hinduism does not just prescribe an aimless rejection of material things. It also offers paths to guide those who are of the belief that worldly aims are not the only end of man. And the Hindu sage Sankaracharya teaches that everything in life, all of one's attachments, fail a man, and that only God does not abandon him. And in a famous poem, he reminds us that time steals everything the way that we're attached to, and so we must worship and love God, who is within our mortal souls even after this lifetime. And I always look to this idea to serve as a guiding force in my quest to somehow transcend worldly desire. And I try to redirect the passion I have towards the outcomes of any work I do into a passion of God, like a sort of offering of any work as a sacrifice, that I do this because of or for the purpose of something grander, not just a personal egotistically motivated sort of action. And in this process, I try to diminish my personal desire to achieve certain ends. So try to do things as an offering to God. And I found this to be a satisfying way to direct the action in my life.
So I think if you ask anybody who's a Hindu about Hinduism, you're going to get very different responses, because it always boils down to what my Hinduism really is. What's the nature of your relationship? What path are you most inclined towards? There's different yogas and all these different types of things, but ultimately it boils down to what works for you and what allows you to have a certain relationship. So let's see. So for this, I'd just like to talk about one central aspect of Hinduism to me, and that is my personal relationship with God through one of his sages or saints or enlightened beings. And the effects of this relationship that my spiritual master has played on my own perspective of life, my relationships to others, and my understanding of my place in the world, and also my sense of purpose. But before I go into these details, I'd just like to give a little bit of context to help understand what exactly I'll be talking about. There's one fundamental relationship that many Hindus will say is central to Hinduism and the understanding of their faith, and that is the relationship between the spiritual teacher, or guru, as we're all familiar with that term, and the disciple or the devotee. Hinduism holds that the sense of difference between ourselves and God, as Dr. Richter said, God is considered to be an underlying essence of everything, but we don't realize it for some reason. And the reason for that is because of the barrier of this small self, this I that always keeps popping up, or this sense of ego that we all have. It's this sense of I-ness and my-ness which we hold, which binds us and is the basis of our ignorance, and limits our capacities and prevents us from understanding our true nature and our true relationship with the Lord. Hinduism holds that in every person, but even not in every person, but in every aspect of creation, there exists some kind of divine spark, a divine potential. And this is the same as the essence of God. And it's just a question of whether we fan the flame or we don't nurture it. And all spirituality ultimately strives to reclaim our lost identity of sense of self, and reunite or build a solid relationship with God in whatever way we conceive Him. But this path is always steep, difficult, and it's filled with pitfalls and maybe littered with temptations or false understandings that might draw us away from the actual path and bind us even further in our own ignorance. And because of that, there are those people who have arrived at the destination and have realized their true essence and their true nature as being one with the divine. And these people are sort of the superheroes of spirituality and of the world in that way. And these we consider the sages, the saints, the God-men, the avatars, and people like the Christs of the world, and even the most exalted Sufis, as Dr. Richter said. Hindus view Sufis in an interesting way. And these God-men are the ones by whose grace our ignorance is eliminated, and they draw us closer to understanding our true nature through our relationships with them. So our duty is simply to love them. And as far as my experience goes, my family followed one saint from India, whose name is Shirdi Sai Baba, not Satya Sai Baba, who's the other person who was on here. But he was actually, he dressed like a Sufi. It was very hard for people to pin down his actual religious affiliation because while he lived in a mosque, he also advocated reading different Hindu texts to his Hindu devotees and advocated namaz and other things for his Muslim devotees. But essentially my life at this point is just trying to understand my relationship to him and try to figure out what it really means to love him in a pure way and a selfless way, and to make sure that I'm aware of his presence in my life, to be devoted, whatever that means. It's a simple word to say, but it's a very heavy one to understand and even a tougher one to implement. And the realization that there's always this striving to overcome my own limitations and to understand the role that he plays in my life is fundamental to what I am and what I hope to be. I hope to be a true devotee of God in that way, and that's what it boils down to. It's a process. So that's all it is.
So my discussion, or I guess my story, won't be too different from the other stories that we've had up here. If anything, it's going to be, of course, based around family. So I guess technically I am born Muslim, but I guess the way that I guess I've come to Islam, I would kind of consider myself a revert actually. So I kind of going into contextualizing everything, I guess. I come from a family that's Muslim, or Sunni Muslims, and while I came from a family that practiced, we prayed 5 times a day, we paid our alms, we went to the great pilgrimage whenever we could, and the lesser one as well. There was a bit of, like Rini mentioned earlier, there was a bit of the way that our religious lives was very separate from, I guess, our everyday life. And what's beautiful about Islam is the fact that Islam, it does mean submission. A lot of people believe that it also means peace. If you ask, the Arabic word for describing Islam is deen, and deen isn't actually a religion or like a structured thing, it's a way of life. And that whole way of life, where everything from the moment that you woke up in the morning to sleeping to being in sleep, is supposed to resonate towards God and towards Islam and living Islam in general. And I didn't see that in my family. So due to some kind of catastrophic, things that happened in my life at a very young age, not that I guess I'm too old right now, at a young age, I kind of reevaluated my beliefs and whether or not I wanted to subscribe to the same lifestyle that my family had been living, because it didn't make sense to me, you know, if I'm bowing my head, you know, towards God 5 times a day. It's the reason why we do it 5 times a day is to remember God, and it's not a ritual just, you know, because you have to do it because God like needs you to, you know, thank Him 5 times a day for everything He's given you. It's to be a constant reminder that, hey, you know, it's morning, I'm waking up, you know, God's in my life. It's, you know, it's in the middle of the day, you're at work, you're at school, but God needs to be in your life. It's not a ritual set time of day as to be a burden. It's just to be a reminder, not at the back of your head, but at the front of your head. So while I was going through this confused state of life, I actually became really close to different religions, Buddhism and Judaism in particular. Judaism, like Kabbalah especially. And through my research, if anything, I actually got brought back to Islam. I realized that despite the way that my family was perhaps practicing their religion, there were, I guess, more intricacies that after doing my own research, I realized that perhaps I need to give Islam another chance. And it worked. It was gorgeous. I felt like I had fallen in love, and not fallen in love with the ritualistic parts of Islam or fallen in love with like the spiritual part of Islam, but as like a whole packaged deal. And but the thing about Islam is that, yeah, you can't be born into the religion. Of course, a lot of us in this room that are Muslim, we were and are. But you don't become a Muslim until you have that conviction, and that conviction isn't gained from your parents, you know, giving you the Quran, being like, hey, you know, 365 days a year, read it every day, and you'll become a Muslim in a couple of years. It's not like that. It's about you ask your own questions and you find the answers to those questions. And when you believe the answers to your questions, that conviction and that relationship comes into your heart by itself. It's not something that, it's not a system of life that you can necessarily be born into. And so, like Professor Richter explained, there is definitely a very ritualistic portion of Islam, which, you know, is denoted by saying the Shahada, which is the declaration of faith, praying 5 times a day, doing the greater and the lesser pilgrimages. But there's a portion of Islam that's extremely spiritual, that's extremely, I guess, it's almost a different world. There's one saying by, another thing, sorry, that Professor Richter touched upon this, about how you don't attain heaven necessarily by doing good deeds. There's, I guess, a process and a lifestyle change that comes with that. And so one of my favorite Sufi saints, actually, her name's Rabia al-Basri, and she had this one saying. So she was roaming the streets of, I believe it was back in the day, Iran, and she was carrying buckets in her arms, and she was saying, I wish I could douse or whatever the word, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, I wish I could put out the flames of hell, and I wish I could burn heaven. And you say that to, like, most people, you're like, what is, you know, what are you talking about, heaven, hell, okay. But what she meant was that because people, I feel like a lot of us, you know, especially within the Abrahamic faith, within more structured religions, we do believe that there's a very systemic way of us becoming good people and of us gaining heaven. And so there was this belief that people had systemized Islam so much that instead of, you know, seeing the purpose behind praying 5 times a day, behind doing all those so-called ritualistic things, that one began falling in love with heaven instead of being in love with God. And so that's I guess why she wanted to burn heaven, and she wanted to douse the flames of hell, because another reason why people would adhere more towards the ritualistic portions of Islam is because people were afraid of going to hell. And the Quran describes heaven in much detail, and it describes hell too. But in the essence, it's heaven and hell. The concepts of heaven and hell are supposed to be secondary to loving God, because God, like, as structured as Islam may seem, people of the book are essentially Christians and Jews. We're all, like, Islam kind of encompasses, especially these 2 other religions, into one thing, that we're all basically brothers and sisters within within humanity and within these religions. And like another thing about Islam that I think really brought to me is that coming from South Asia, my parents are from around the time when there was the partition. And I guess speaking a little bit, I guess for my story there are a few historically specific moments that brought me to where I am today. My parents came from a time where, when the partition happened, there was a lot of religious tension, and so there were those stereotypes about how religion had split, people that lived as brothers and sisters for many centuries before apart. And so there were these stereotypes of otherizing these other religions and these other people, despite all of us coming from essentially the same home. And so after when I went back and did my own research, I found that in essence Islam is very all-encompassing. A lot of people, I feel like, especially the way Islam is portrayed in the media these days, it's considered a really hard-lined religion. All women are supposed to be oppressed, all men are supposed to be wife beaters, and we're all just very, and in these tight boxes, I feel like is how a lot of people think about Muslims. But the truth is that especially if you go down more the spiritual path, personally, I have very strong Sufi leanings. You kind of discover a new world that is to Islam, a more encompassing, I guess, world where God isn't just, this is black and this is white. There is so much gray space that I feel like not a lot of people within Islam know, but a lot of people from outside Islam know. There is no necessarily right and wrong. That was basically my story. I was going to get into how I got into hijab, but I guess if that's a question that comes up, I can definitely talk about that. And yeah, that's kind of how I came to Islam, and about how I realized that it's basically a way to live your life. It's a lifestyle, and it is a way of life versus your private life and your religious life being two separate entities within your own soul. So, yeah.